Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. It's another standing video for the same reason as the previous one. This is part one of the religious series. And this episode is chiefly just going to be about the different kinds of theism. Because religion without theism is debatably not religious. Actually, you know what? Let's actually start off with the criteria for a religion. Generally speaking, the criteria, at least by Western standards, is that it has to answer three questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? What is my purpose? If it doesn't answer those questions, it's probably more likely a philosophy. And there are philosophies that do answer those questions, but because they don't have any kind of cosmology or structure that really resembles a religion, they're normally not actually considered. And they often exist within presuppositions regarding other religions. Like the Greek philosophies, almost all of them, there are exceptions, they acknowledge the Greek pagan pantheon, which I'll get into what kind of religion that is in a minute. And Buddhism, for example, some people argue whether it's a religion or a philosophy because it doesn't necessarily answer those questions. In fact, it generally posits that they're irrelevant, that suffering is the main thing that people should be concerned with. But I think it's important to note that it exists within the confines, cultural confines, of Hinduism. Now, it's branched off from that, obviously, and it's latched onto other belief systems, in fact. But the very fact that other belief systems exist in tandem with it, I think, is a good indication that it's more of a philosophy than a religion, but I totally understand why that is a very murky subject, and people might be offended one way or the other, to be honest. But it is what it is. It's a murky subject. But generally speaking, religions answer those three questions, and they tend to follow cosmology of some pantheon that also explains those things. Not necessarily. So let's start with polytheism. Why? Because it's generally regarded as the oldest, and it's also because I previously mentioned the Greek pantheon. So polytheism is the religious structure that identifies multiple deities with multiple things. So a god of fire like Hephaestus, a goddess of the hearth like Vesta, an hierarchy, in other words. Usually they're related to, and you can see this with Greek, Norse, and also Germanic, even though that's mostly pronunciation issue with Norse, and Slavic. If you look at their mythology, if you look at their pantheon, there's sort of a family tree structure. Zeus is the god of the earth, and then his brother Poseidon is the god of the ocean, and his other brother Hades is the god of the underworld. And then all the other deities that inhabit the earth and the underworld and the ocean, they're children of those different deities. So if, like, say there's a naiad or a naiad of a spring that flows from the ocean, from that water getting filtered through the ground, that naiad would be the offspring of either Poseidon or one of his children. See how that works? Same thing goes with all the other deities. The deities of the earth, Dionysus, the god of wine, Hermes, the messenger god, Hercules, also known as Heracles. I almost said Hercules and Heracles at the same time. That's why I sounded Irish there for a second or whatever. They're all children of Zeus. And Zeus is the offspring of Cronus. And Rhea, was it? You get the idea. The gods are related, is the point. And you see this also with Egyptian polytheism. Generally speaking, if you have a pantheon, the first question that people ask is, well, where did all this come from? And the answer is usually some sort of chaos. Oftentimes it's the air and the land meeting, among chaos and creating order. This is how it is with Greek mythology. This is how it is with Shinto. That started with, was it Izanagi and Izanami? The sky and the land, in other words, and they produced the islands of Japan and all the other continents as a consequence. And then those aspects of the world, natural aspects, very important to note, they ended up with subsequent deities themselves. So, like Amaterasu, which, even though she's a solar deity, that was regarded as sort of a terrestrial thing because they didn't really understand outer space at the time. And the same thing goes with Apollo and Diana, moon and the sun, respectively. They're the offspring of Zeus, even though Zeus is the god of the land. It really gives you a good indication of how they viewed the earth. Geocentrism isn't some archaic Christian view. It's a very ancient view that's pretty commonplace. But yeah, polytheism, different aspects of nature and subsequently of society, they have a reflection in divinity through the existence of a deity. And it can extend to anything. There are deities for much more modern concepts. I mentioned that Hephaestus was a Greek god of fire. Really, he's more associated with blacksmithing than anything. He was a forger of metal objects, including weapons and armor and tools. So it doesn't just extend exclusively to the natural world. It goes well beyond that. Now we move on from polytheism to monotheism, which is the complete opposite. If you know anything about etymology at all, if you can break down words at all, you probably know that if polytheism means many deities, monotheism means a singular deity. And I find it interesting to note that societies that have singular deities, they tend to be more, I don't want to use the word civilized, more urban. They tend to be more urban. And I think that you can see a pattern there, because if you're living in small groups, small bands and tribes in a natural setting, it's easy to make distinguishing characteristics between natural phenomena and what you would regard as something worthy of reverence or worship. But if you're living in a more urban society, and by the way, the word pagan, which is associated with polytheism, means country dweller. So something to note. Monotheism would lend itself more to an urban society because everything's just sort of unified anyway. Like, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're a hunter-gatherer, right? You need to hunt deer in order to keep your family alive. And while you're doing that, your spouse, she's picking berries to keep the family alive. Those would be two very separate acts with two very separate divinities. A harvest goddess, for example, for the wife, and a hunter god for the husband. That makes sense, right? Well, if you're living in a city and you're going to a grocer or a butcher / greengrocer or whatever, you're getting your food from a singular source. There wouldn't be that separation. Similarly, you're not harvesting timber for fuel, so fire in the household would also be acquired from the marketplace as well. So, as you can see, there's only two directions you could go if you lived in a very urban setting. You could either have a significant explosion of gods where they reflect everything, like, for example, a god for lawyers and a god for, cabbage sellers, scribes, etc. Or you could narrow it down and there just becomes a singular, universal deity that just cares about everybody, and therefore you don't have to figure out what ritual you have to perform in order to appease said deity, right? So it makes sense that monotheism would sort of be a natural progression from polytheism as cultures become more urban, become more specialized. I know this is kind of a rigid pronouncement and a debatable one, but I would go so far as to say that polytheists are generalists. They tend to be jacks of all trades. And monotheists are specialists. They tend to be good at one thing that may be completely irrelevant in a more primitive mode of living. So that leads us to the next progression. Oh, let me give some examples of monotheism, because that's where things get a little fun too. Is Islam monotheistic? Absolutely. Is Judaism monotheistic? Modern Judaism is. Pre-biblical Judaism is debatable. They seem to have had quite the extensive pantheon, and then El, also known as Yahweh, sort of took over. Corporate takeover kind of thing. But modern Judaism I would definitely regard as monotheistic. Is Christianity monotheistic? Now see, that's where things get really fun. For example, Muslims one of the things they criticize Christians with is that they're polytheists because they believe in a trinity rather than a single deity. But then if you ask a Christian, they would argue that all three of them are singular, even though they have separate emanations. So it becomes a very debatable topic, and one that really pisses people off, because generally if you think one way, you are not cool with even considering the alternative. And the reason I saved Christianity for last and how muddled that definition is because it kind of actually leads into pantheism, because Christianity posits that there's a singular creator of the universe, but he also exists in three separate emanations, and also not three separate emanations at the same time. Well, pantheism takes that idea and it applies it to literally everything. Hang on, I have a roly-poly on my wall because I let them do free-range stuff, and yeah, let me pause it real quick and get that roly-poly, put him back in his terrarium. Yeah, weird, I know. It was never my intention to let them be free-range. They just they all figured their way out of the mesh on top, and now they just do whatever they want. Sometimes I have to collect them and put them back. But anyway, where was I? Polytheism, monotheism? Pantheism. Pantheism takes that idea of, things being separate but united at the same time in a very complicated manner, and it applies that to everything. So matter, energy, people, places, things, they're all just God. They're all just a singular being, one being. Now, that leads me into monism, because these are the most easily comparable, because monism takes that idea and says, in addition, there is nothing else. Like, the other things that we perceive are an illusion. There is only the one with a capital O. There is only God. Whereas with pantheism, there's a lot more leeway. Things can exist separate and identical. And the reason I bring that up is because comparing the two, it's really hard to make a contrast, because they seem to be the same and yet they're also not. Well, I think this Schrodinger's Jesus with regard to Christianity, is Jesus God or is Jesus the Son of God? And you ask a Christian scholar and the argument is, well, he is both. Well, is monism pantheism or is pantheism monism? And the answer is a little bit both. Now, the best way to view it, in my opinion, is that all monists are pantheists, but not all pantheists are monists, because pantheists is a broader category. Pantheists can conclude that all is one, but at the same time separate. At the same time, for example, a person can be a person with a divine spark in them, but they don't necessarily have to be one with God. They don't have to actually be the same. It's almost like, where does a river end and the ocean begin? It's kind of like that. You can view them as separate and the same a little more loosely. Whereas with monism would posit, it's all the ocean. This idea that the river is separate is an illusion. See how that works? So yeah, this is going to be some important groundwork for when we're comparing and contrasting different religions in the subsequent episodes. So I hope this gives you guys some idea as to the categories, what constitutes a religion, and the different kinds of religions that are out there. Those are the big four, though: monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, and monism. So thanks, like, share, subscribe, and keep asking questions, and look forward to making this follow-up video. See you guys.